to do our work. So we always first do an analysis and then research and see if there are any similar projects and how we can learn from them. And then we start planning for actually implementing it and evaluating whether we can implement it or not. And then we start implementing it. So we have currently a few projects. One of them is a circuit design course, actually a whole lab in the Polytechnic University, where an international software from Cadence Systems in Texas, which is a well-known software used by most large companies like NVIDIA and others for circuit design, which is electronic circuit design. And so we are teaching students how to do circuit design by modern, very popular software, because right now the only software, the only available software is through Synopsys, and that is their own software, and nobody else can use it. So now we're teaching students how to use internationally recognized software so that large companies like NVIDIA, AMD, and others can actually, you know, provide work to the students in the future. We also have our annual invention competition. We have right now, we have received this year 11 inventions in different subjects. We send these inventions to experts, they evaluate it, and then we actually decide the best of all, and the best of all is awarded $10,000. The reason we make it to only one of the teams, because we would like to see them progress more and even try to come up with a product to encourage innovation and creation of jobs. We also work with the universities, other than Polytechnic, also the Yerevan State University, and many of the institutes like the Molecular Biology Institute, the Physical Chemistry Institute in Ashtarak, Ghaplanyan National Lab, where we have established the first clean room in Armenia. And also we work with two other teams in the Ghaplanyan National Lab. One of them has developed a instrument which is called radio frequency photomultiplier tube, which essentially can detect a laser pulse down to 5 picoseconds. That is a very, very short time, and it's actually never achieved in any other with any other instrument. So we are trying to commercialize that instrument, and we're working on that. We also work with the detection room, where they try to develop crystal-based detectors in the Ghaplanyan National Lab. And also we work with Chemical Physics Institute as well, and also with a group of an optical lab in the Yerevan State University. So we're trying to do as much as we can, even though our resources are very limited. And the way we do our activities is through donations from people like you who attend our panel discussions or events. And so we would like to, of course, very much if you can donate, if you like what you are hearing. So without further ado, I would like to now introduce our moderator, which is Dr. Ani Shabazian. She's a professor at Loyola Marymount University and is also has received many awards, of course. She's the author of books and many, many articles, and she's done research in areas related to children's development. And she's also the director of Early Childhood Center in the Loyola Marymount University. Ani, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Panossian, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, as always. It's a pleasure to be here today. Good morning and good evening to those of you tuning in from abroad, including all of our panelists, as well as Dr. Panossian, who's in Armenia right now. I would like to thank the ARPA Institute for featuring this conversation on being Armenian today, negotiating identity between homeland and diaspora. Through their steadfast work in Armenia, the ARPA Institute continues to serve as a steady reminder to us all that progress can be made together. Our objective with our time here today is to have a discussion about how the national identity of Armenians has been forged through a complex interplay of history, culture, politics, and diaspora, tempered by survival under empires, the rupture of genocide, the experience of exile, and the projects of statehood. In the era of mobility and cultural blending, Armenianness is no longer anchored to a single geography, language, or script. From Yerevan to LA, Beirut to Paris, this conversation examines, and Lisbon, this conversation examines how Armenians build belonging across languages, borders, and generations, balancing preservation and adaptation, memory, and reinvention. We'll discuss hybrid identities, shifting ties to homeland, and the creative practices that sustain community. Can a shared Armenianness persist amid such diversity? And what might it look like today? I look forward to all of us listening closely and engaging with our speakers. The speakers will present shortly, and each of them 5 to 7 minute presentation. And then I will ask a series of questions as the mediator. And then I would like to offer the floor to you. So what I don't address, you can do so by writing your questions in the chat box. And so let me tell you a little bit about our guest speakers here today. Dr. Razmig Panossian is a Canadian Armenian political scientist and historian, best known for his scholarship on Armenian national identity, diaspora studies, and Armenia-diaspora relations. Since 2013, he has a long resume, but he's graciously allowed me to truncate it. Since 2013, he has served as the director of the Armenian Communities Department at the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation in Lisbon. Thank you for your time here today, Razmig. Dr. Ara Sanjian holds a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and is an associate professor of history and the director of Armenian Research Center at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. His research focuses on post-World War I history of Armenia, Turkey, and the Arab states of Western Asia. Thank you for your time here today. Dr. Hratch Tchilingirian is a sociologist, author, and innovation executive. He is the director of the Institutional Innovation at the Western Diocese of Armenian Church. Since 2021, is the associate professor of Armenian Studies in INALCO University in Paris. He was the director of the Armenian Diaspora Survey, a major research project that was funded by the Gulbenkian Foundation, which studied public opinion, he'll be talking about this later, of 13,000 diaspora Armenian studies across 10 countries. And last but not least, we have Dr. Irina Ghaplanyan. She is a political scientist, a climate negotiator, and a published author. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge, an MA degree in diplomatic studies from the Diplomatic Academy of London, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in international relations from the University of Malta. Her main areas of expertise are political leadership, states in transition, climate politics, environmental management, and gender and conflict, as well as security studies. She has worked in a number of international organizations and think tanks around the world, and has been a catalyst for change in the field of sustainable business and social entrepreneurship in Armenia. Thank you for your time here today, Irina. With no further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to the panelists and ask them to each just do a brief overarching summary of their areas of inquiry. I'd like to start with Dr. Razmig Panossian.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Hago, for this very kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to speak at the ARPA Forum. I'm going to speak with my hat on as a historian, and I'm going to do a very broad overview of Armenian identity construction. So I'm going to try to cover in 5 to 7 minutes about 3,000 years of history, but focusing more on the latter part. So I'm going to start with a very obvious point that is worth repeating, and that is that identity is not fixed. It is constructed. To use social science jargon, it is imagined. But when we speak of imagined identity, we're not saying that it is imaginary. We're not saying it is false. We're not saying it's shallow. It means that it is built and rebuilt constantly from century to century, from generation to generation. And towards the end, you will see how even from decade to decade, we have been reconstructing our identity as Armenians. And in this, intellectuals play a very important role. I'm also going to be, when we're talking about identity, we're talking about the thread that continues. We're not talking about the assimilated, the ones who have migrated, and historically Armenians have done that. They have assimilated into the Byzantine Empire, into the Persian Empire, etc., etc. But so we're talking about a thread that has continued for, almost 3,000 years. And in fact, many of us know, as many of you know, that the first reference to Armenians is 6th century BC, where it's written on a Behistun rock at 520 by King Darius of Persia, that he conquered the lands of Armenia. So that's our first reference, written reference that we have of Armenians. And in fact, we also know that the first map of the world, the Babylonian map, has Armenia on it in the form of Urartu, which is a precursor to Armenia. So this is how we started as a people. But there has been certain fundamental moments where we have reshaped our collective identity. The first major one is when we became Christian in 301, as we all know, and that cemented Armenians as an ethno-religious identity. So to be Armenian, you had to be part of the Armenian Apostolic Church. A century later, the alphabet was added to this, a unique Armenian alphabet, and a textual basis of identity emerged that we still celebrate, Takman Chatsis these days. And it's very important to note this continuous, relatively stable cultural basis. Empires and states came and went, but the church remained, this ethno-religious identity remained fairly stable for about 1,500 years. Then things become much more interesting. The Mkhitarist Catholic order in the 18th, 19th centuries did something that was fundamental to Armenian identity, and that is they separated what it meant to be Armenian from being apostolic Christian. They were Catholics, so Christianity was obviously important. You had to be Christian to be Armenian, but they actually managed to their intellectual output to say that you can be Armenian without being apostolic. You can be a good Catholic and a good Armenian. Take a step further into the 19th century, secularism coming from Europe starts to enter the scene, as well as the political dimension. And what we believe as our modern national identity emerges in the 19th century, parallel to Europe, in which sovereignty of the people, self-rule, is central. It's the legitimate political order, and this is a radically new idea in our identity as a people in the 19th century, the revolutionary parties being the best manifestations of this, 1880s onwards. At the same time, vernacular language is emerging into this. Whereas before the vernacular language, most people in Armenia spoke dialects or Turkish. The vernacular language as Armenian, Western and Eastern, with its two branches, enters the mix. And towards the end of the 19th century, it is now part of our identity. As to be Armenian, you had to know the language, the vernacular language. Also note that in this process of this very quick overview of millennia, from 1375 to 1918, so roughly 650 years, this identity is reformulation, constant negotiation is taking place without a state. It's taking place in diasporan centers, especially in 18th century onwards, in Tbilisi, Constantinople, Istanbul, Venice, St. Petersburg, Madras, And so the diasporan component of thinking who we are as a people, as a nation, not just in diaspora, but as a nation as a whole, has its roots in our diasporan centers, intellectual centers. Again, remember, intellectuals are key to this identity formulation. And so, hence my ongoing, personally, skepticism of putting the state at the center of national identity all the time. And many others object to this. Now, post-genocide, early 20th century, it gets even more fragmented. We get identity, multiple vectors of identity building, and the two fundamental ones are in parallel to each other, against each other, but also in parallel to each other. What's taking place in diasporan communities and in a post-genocide diasporan communities, and what's taking place in Soviet Armenia. So in diasporan communities, especially in the Middle East, very consciously, a new diasporan identity is being forged as an exiled nation. So we're a people, we're a nation, we've been killed, expelled, and now we are going to imagine ourselves as a diasporan nation. And in this, it's very clear when you look at how this is being done, and it's a very clear political project. Language plays a key role. So Armenophone communities, it's central to Armenian. So in the 1920s, people in the Middle East that spoke basically dialects and Turkish became Armenophone, Armenian speakers. That was the first thing. The second thing was you had to have historical knowledge, so through education to know who you were, your ancestors, etc. There was a political dimension with the commitment to the Armenian cause, defined differently by various sectors of the community. Core of it was return to the homeland, and homeland was very clearly historic lost lands in eastern Turkey. Being mobilized, i.e. participation in community organizations, was also an element of being a good Armenian. And church affiliation remained, of course, apostolic, but also Catholic and evangelical. And finally, there was a very strong element of anti-Turkishness, understandably so. Parallel to this, in Soviet Armenia, a different project was going on, and the Soviets were really advocating for Armenia, Soviet Armenia, as the homeland, as the center of culture, as a center of identity. And these two were battling it out throughout the 20th century. And this battle, we can still see that today. A couple of days ago, there was a conference here about Kalus Gulbenkian and his network of Armenian art dealers. And one of the speakers, Sato Mughalian, talked about this artistic organization established in 1916 in Tbilisi that was called the Armenian Artists Union. 1921, what did the Soviets do? They rename it to the Union of Artists of Armenia. So, Hayasdani, Gazmager. And you see this debate today, and we'll talk about that later on. Anyway, so 1916 comes, and this that Soviet diasporan identity building, something else comes into it, which is a politicized understanding of the genocide and the demands and the high tide element of it that is both in Soviet Armenia and in the diaspora. So this was something that was shared, although with different means. Jump ahead, 1988, the Qarabağ movement. All of a sudden, all the eyes are on Artsakh and Armenia. The vector of identity quite suddenly moves to some place most Armenians in the diaspora had not heard of, Nagorno-Karabakh. Artsakh was not used at that point all that much. And very quickly, Yergir, homeland, changes from historic Armenia for the established diaspora to independent Armenia with the slogan of Tebi Yergir, to the homeland. This Armenia-based centered focus from the diaspora was reinforced with the euphoria of 1918 revolution. 2 years later, it was shattered by the defeat in the war and the ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2013. So now we have come full circle. the diaspora is thinking itself back, or it's sort of turned its gaze back towards itself, back to diaspora as a center of identity. And we are already seeing this in popular discourses, in also quiet conversations. And the realization that we in the diaspora have neglected ourselves and indeed weakened it for 35 years. And that should not have been the case. And the symbolic moment of this was when Aram Vehapar of Antillas declared 2022 and 2023 as a Spirkidari, Year of the Diaspora. But the fragmentation of the diaspora has continued and will continue. We have to accept this. We have to live with this. We have the new diaspora, the established diaspora, the traditional structures, the new structures that challenging them. And in some cases, like I think in Los Angeles, there is a melange, a mix of these different things. And another layer of the complication is Armenia's policies towards the diaspora, which is dismissal of the diaspora, a certain sector of the diaspora, and this new ideology of real Armenia, which again we will talk about later on. So to sum up, let's say in 1600, what it meant to be Armenian, you could have asked, let's say, a peasant, and he or she would have said in Turkish or in dialect, to be part of the Apostolic Church. In the 19th century, they would have said to speak some Armenian. In the mid-20th century, for sure, language, a notion of national cause. 1991, Nagorno-Karabakh independence would have come into it as being part of Armenian, winning the war. And now we're at a loss. There is no fixed definition. Let's not kid ourselves. There is no fixed definition of Armenian identity. We are who we make ourselves to be. Again, with intellectuals playing an important role. It's an ongoing process, constantly negotiated. And what I would say at this point, the best way to define our identity is on a purely subjective basis, with all the diversity and instability that this entails. Someone is Armenian if he or she says, I am Armenian because I say I'm Armenian, and others accept me as such. So I think we are at this point now, and I'll stop my introductory comments here.
So much to go from those introductory comments, and you can. I feel like I just took an entire semester worth of coursework in that 5 minutes. I'd like to invite Dr. Aras Sanjian to state his introduction and extend on some of these thoughts.
Thank you. Basically what I will say was just a few notes on what Razmig says and a few relatively new points that he didn't really make. But let me start from a very important issue for those outside the actual people who conduct this research. When we talk about our identity, especially identity in the past, and we read that in the 7th century, in the 19th century, this was the case, that was the case. How do we know about this? And this is a very important thing, because the amount of information that we have about earlier centuries is not equal. And specifically, at least up until 1840, what we have in the written sources and even in the visual sources like inscriptions and sculpture, etc., it's a very, very elitist view of what was it. There is no way in which we can be certain if everybody at the time of Yerishe, who wrote about the Battle of Avarair, or anybody who was a contemporary of Movses Khorenatsi shared the same view of what being Armenian was as these authors. So this is a very, very important aspect of it. Nowadays, of course, you can do sociological research and other stuff and know to what extent, for example, a villager in Armenia shares Nigor Pashinyan's views of what is an Armenian, etc. And of course, for the ancient centuries, we cannot actually do that. After 1840, when we start having the modern concept of a press, both in Tiflis and in Constantinople to start with, maybe it becomes a bit broader, but of course not as much as when we start conducting sociological research, and that only happened in the last 2 or 3 decades, not earlier than that. And the important thing here as well is, and we're going to refer to this, how much of what is elitist, read and discussed by later generations of scholars does actually become public knowledge, even in the age of universal public education. Armenians were among the earliest peoples, among the maybe the second or third in the Middle East to actually think about having an network of community schools, etc. And but even now, especially after the pandemic, etc., and especially after what's happening in America, we have to know how much of what teachers are teaching in the school is actually sinking in with the people, with so many people, for example, questioning vaccines, so many people really not paying any attention to all the principles of democracy and etc. that are taught in American schools for decades. So probably that's the same thing as well when we should look at Armenian identity. And when we read in school textbooks and in newspapers generalized issues about Armenian past, we should also know that a lot of what we read are actually assumptions made by later scholars. And so the amount of primary sources that we have give room to other interpretations, which for different reasons, of course, have not really gained currency and acceptance. For example, you may have different explanations of why there are these two parallel names for us, Hai and Armenian. Technically, we do not know. We only know that from the time of the Behistun inscription, and there is a contemporary Greek historian who also mentions the Armenians roughly at that time, we were known as Armenians. We all know that when in the 5th century Armenian literature is being produced, already this division of Hai and Armenian was there. When did it come about? Why was it, etc.? Everything that you read is basically just guesswork. I'm not saying that academics should not do this kind of guesswork and offer possible scenarios, but we should also know that these are all interpretations. I think from the viewpoint of identity, to see how those interpretations have changed over the years, over decades, and maybe even over centuries, is itself a source to look at our understanding. As I always say, it's not important whether Vartan was a hero, Vasag a traitor, or vice versa. The important thing, when did we start discussing this? We started discussing this only at the end of the 19th century, very early 20th century. And that's why what was happening there, that suddenly some people thought that we should reinterpret the church's definition or Yerisha's definition of Vasag. Something was happening around. So that's one example. I have a few footnotes to what Razmig said. There was vernacular before the 19th century, and the vernacular would have really developed had the Kilikian kingdom survived, because in Kilikia essentially there was the official classical Karapar for religion, but there was what we now call the Michin Hayaren, for the day-to-day business. Nersesh Norali wrote important religious texts in Karapar, but also collected, for example, Armenian riddles and recorded them actually in Michin Hayaren, in Middle Armenian. Another important thing for us in the past, which is now different, is how much we looked at the script as sacred, the Ipupen. Not only, I think we are one of the very few nations who have turned the Ipupen into an icon. And in our own house, we can have that kind of an A to K, IPEN K, or from IP to Fe, as if some kind of a thing on us, in our, for example, guest rooms hanging on the wall, which probably few other nations do. We also see that for a long, long time, when Armenians did not speak Armenian, some of their intellectual class continued to write those foreign languages in the Armenian script. Nowadays, it's 180 degrees the other way around. In America, for example, we want our kids to learn a few words of Armenian. We don't care about them recognizing the 38 letters, so instead we try to write about them in Latin script so that they will read that. Like, for example, in the church, when we have next to the Armenian text as to how you should read that by Latin script. The issue of this 19th century change is very fundamental. I think in modern Armenian history, the 19th century is the most important period where there is a fundamental shift in the criteria with which Armenianness is defined. It goes back, of course, to the work of the Mkhitarist in the 18th century to some extent. And this idea that what was a religious community in the Ottoman Empire, the millet, was translated as ask in Western Armenian is something which still continues. You know that in most of the Western diasporan Armenian communities which come from the Ottoman Empire, Askain Marminer simply still means the Armenian Orthodox Church bodies. The Catholics and the Orthodox and the Evangelicals are never considered to be part of Askain Marmin. Their schools are not Askain Tabrots. The Askain Tabrots are the church. So that use of the ask to some extent is continuing, and it really contradicts with the official translation of the word nation in its academic sense into ask as well, something which even the current prime minister of Armenia is at odds of how to really figure out that when he is trying to talk about these issues. The Ashkharapar basically became two for political reasons. There would have been one Ashkharapar, I'm sure, if there had been just one political entity within which the Armenians have lived. It is a very artificial language. It was never spoken as such by anybody. It was just really made. But again, this is not something unique. Most other countries also have some kind of a standard vernacular which does not really coincide with any of its dialects. And the point that Razmig made, which is very important, and I think we should study it further, is that many of these institutions did emerge in a non-state setting, both in Constantinople and in Tiflis. I don't think we're the only one in the world to have done that, but that aspect of the 19th century, what we call the Armenian awakening, has not been studied yet. Now, Razmig was also important to look at this issue of territorialization of identity in the Soviet Union. Ultimately, the Soviet Union's idea was to create one, not only Soviet nation, but one population in the world with no kind of any linguistic and cultural fundamental differences. So for them, basically using the language was to make the spread of those ideas quicker on a certain territory where that language was heavily spoken. And that's why, for example, if you were living in Goris in Armenia, you had all the privileges to develop your Armenianness, while the much larger Armenian community in Moscow, for example, in terms of numbers, was never given of those kind of things. And the same was, of course, true for all that kind of non-titular nationalities across the various republics. In the diaspora, I think there's something which we have to really care about. This idea that Armenia was cut off from the diaspora is much more common among the supporters or those who were in the influence of the Tashtak party. Yes, they formed the majority. The Tashtak party is much more organized, has a much wider network. But ultimately, since I grew up in a different community, I will never agree that Armenia in my family was out of it. So there were Armenians in the diaspora, those who supported the Tchilingirian party, those who supported the Ramgavar party, to some extent those who were with the HU. For them, even in its Soviet sense, Armenia was really considered to be much important and culturally so much part of them. This is also something that is being now realized by those who are studying, but has to actually be studied further. Now coming to the present. Razmig said that, we're constructivists. I think most of people in the Western academia are now, but not everybody in Armenia. Some historians, very influential people in Armenia, are still what we call primordialists. They don't see any kind of a fundamental change in the Armenianness, and they think that Armenianness was the same when Armenians were first recorded in history, and essentially there has been very change. They really believe that there was just a period of slumber, and then in the 19th century they recovered what was lost, something which of course modern constructivists will not agree. And this is at the essence of some of the sharp debates that we have in Armenian historiography today in Armenia, which are also spreading to the diaspora about how to look at that. One other problem in academia is, and this is of course I think much more a an effect of Stalinism. I will use the word Stalinism specifically because pre-Stalin, the Soviet Union did not have that for the first 10, 15 years of its existence, is the politicization and weaponization of, debate. Essentially, academics are not considered by some people as having of different opinions, but are classified as acceptable heroes, Hayrenassers, patriots, and the others are Tavajans. And this is, of course, problematic because some of the people in high space in academia are using this kind of a language in order to conduct their debates with other people, something which prior to 1950s, even in the Soviet Union, as far as I know, was never done. When two people disagreed on when Khorenatsi lived or whether he was a Chalcedonian or not, I'm giving a fact example, they did not accuse one another that I am a better Armenian because I think he's from the 5th century, and you are not a good Armenian because you're saying it because he was from the 8th century. So this has now really made it even more difficult to have a debate. And last and by last, Pashinyan post-2020. It's very interesting how much he is spending now time on reading history, yeah, and also lecturing people on history. And I really don't know if people in Armenia, I'm talking about the ordinary folk, if they were asked if this was a priority for them, they would have agreed with it. But ultimately, as he is reading what happened in 2020 up to 2023, and he is trying to come up with an interpretation, he has concluded that this is something very, very important to take up. And he is using his authority both within the constitutional framework of the country and also as the undisputed leader of the ruling group, yeah, actually to push forward a certain kind of an agenda, which probably is very normal to come up, but is also has become very, very politicized because actually the number one figure in the country is heavily involved in this. It leads into shifting of what the political aims of being Armenian would be, and it is basically going on questioning the sanctity of important symbols. It is this idea of emphasizing even more the importance of the state and essentially looking at those which are outside the state, including many people in the diaspora, as something secondary, and and at some stage it comes out, we don't care about you, go and do whatever you like. Although this is not actually said literally, but in some cases, some of his statements come near it. And this is a very kind of interesting thing about how we'll develop, because ultimately identities develop not by individuals. Yes, individuals come up with certain suggestions, but it's really the time, the changes, etc. do affect. How much of this will survive? How much of this will be modified? How much of this will be discarded? Nobody can know, because it really depends on so many other factors. But it's also very important that those people who are actually opposing, and there is a significant opposition to these ideas, especially among the educated intellectual circles in Armenia. I think more than the average population. It's also a very kind of a defensive kind of protection of symbols, etc., but probably with not necessarily that kind of urge about, okay, how do you look at that in the current stage? So this is I think not surprising. It is very interesting. I know it's really being done at a level which is very sharp, has become very politicized, but it's just another example of that identities are never fixed. And even at one time, people can have different interpretations of that heritage and identity, and we are passing through a stage in Armenian history like that at this particular moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sanjian, for raising, from an academic perspective, you raise such issues around historiography, historical trajectory, and reframing that we're going to delve into a lot more in a little bit. Before we move on, I'd like to invite Dr. Tchilingirian to speak a little bit more about his overview of the more modern diasporic, probably, context.
Okay. Thank you, Ani. And I'm going to share, I'd like to show some slides. Do you see my screen, the slides? Okay, very good. So what I would like to do is to continue on what Razmig and Ara already laid out, a very good background and the context. I want us to come to the 21st century, and I would like to
share with you primarily the results of the Armenian Diaspora Survey, which took place between 2018 and 2022. And we've asked 13,000 Armenians in 10 countries in the diaspora, which included more than 50 communities. There were more than one community in each country. I don't want to go into too much details, but I want to focus on when we are saying Armenian identity, what are some of the main ingredients of this? And to give you a flavor of the variety of perceptions and ideas, I want to quote from some of the 400 interviews that we did as part of this research. And just to quote some of the young people who articulated what is it to be an Armenian. A gentleman, this young gentleman in Lebanon, said, "For me, being Armenian is a package." And he used the word package when he's speaking in Armenian. I think it is a matter of deciding. When you decide to be Armenian, that's it. You are Armenian. So this is one idea which is shared by many others. Another young person in the United States with Irish and Jewish family heritage said, "I identify mostly as Armenian, even though I am half Armenian. That's the side of the family that I've always really had the more cultural connection with." So here we see that it's the family and the connections. Another person, a young person, again in the United States, she said, "Even though I grew up in the United States, I grew up in this little post-Soviet Union Armenian community in Lansing, Michigan. Pretty much everyone in the community is Armenian, but most people came from Baku. This pretty much defined how I do anything." And finally, another example, a Lebanon-born young man currently living in Toronto. He explains by mixing Armenian and English when in his explanations, and I want to reproduce to give you a flavor of the variety. At this point, he said, "I consider myself more of an Armenian Canadian than an Armenian Lebanese. Դունես դուրս իմ կանադական մշակույթը practice գնեի ամբողջությամբ։ Իսկ իմ հայ ընկերներուս հետ իմ կանադահայ մշակույթս practice գնեի։ Իսկ ընտանիքիս հետ իմ լիբանանահայ ենթամշակույթս practice գնեի." You have to manage every situation according to your audience. Գնա քիչմը անցին շվարեցնել, then you run the risk of abandoning one. So we see that definition of Armenian is not monolithic, it's not commonly understood by everyone. And here I want to share with you some of the results of our research about identity. One of the main points that comes across in our research is that most Armenian diasporans identify themselves as hyphenated Armenians. More than half say I'm Armenian American or Canadian Armenian or Bulgarian Armenian or Lebanese Armenian. So there's always the local culture and the context that goes hand in hand with the Armenian. And only about 4 in 10 say just I'm Armenian. In some countries, as you see at the bottom of the page, France, in Lebanon, in Britain, you see that in some countries, the percentage of this hyphenated identity is even higher than more than half. I'm not going to go into the reasons for that. Another important, when we ask, how do they define their Armenian identity? And I think the results are very interesting. The top 3 defining elements is family, nearly, about 7 in 10 say that family is number one, Armenian language and Armenian culture. We see that, for instance, Christian heritage is 30%, is kind of on the bottom half of the list of this multiple choice. Republic of Armenia is much less in terms of defining Armenian identity. And in some instances, for instance, in the United States, we see that it's over, 84% consider family as the number one or top defining element. Again, as I think Razmig or Aras mentioned, the genocide is at the bottom of this list of defining elements. Religion, we spoke about religion. Again, very interesting that according to our survey, 35% say that you can be of any faith or religion to be Armenian. Another 22% say it's not important to belong to any religion, to be Armenian. So if we combine these two numbers, so 57, nearly 6 in 10 do not consider religion or Christianity in this case as an important aspect of being Armenian. So you can be Armenian anyway, whether you have a religion, whether you're Christian, or you belong to any other religion. Only 20%, about 20% say that Armenian can only be Christian. And again, on the historical trajectory, as we see that this has really changed tremendously, this perception of the place of religion and Christianity in the perception of Armenian identity. Of course, when we ask about the importance of Christianity, 82% say that Christianity is important for Armenian identity as a cultural aspect. However, it doesn't mean that 82% are religious or they practice Armenian Christianity on a daily basis. The percentage goes down when we ask them about their engagement with the church and religiosity. But this is, I think, an important result in terms of religion. Then we are also whenever we're talking about the contemporary diaspora, obviously we talk about politics and political parties. And here again, nearly 8 out of 10 are not affiliated with any of the Armenian political parties. And some 15% are politically engaged, but outside the traditional Armenian political parties. Again, here, this is something to take on board when we are talking about diaspora identity. Another aspect that we spoke in terms of Armenia and the homeland, Hayrenik, we assume many a times that when we say Hayrenik or homeland, everybody understands Armenia or the Republic of Armenia today. But that's not the case according to our research. 52% consider homeland to be the country where they were born. In some countries, for instance, in Argentina, here in Romania, and in Russia, Rostov-on-Don, we see that 3/4 of the respondents say that their Hayrenik, their homeland, is the country where they were born. And about 4 in 10 say that the Republic of Armenia is Hayrenik or the homeland. So again, we see that there is no unanimous perception or understanding of what homeland is in the perception of the diasporans today. Another area that this is on a more practical dimension, when we talk about or ask them about their ideas and opinions about their communities, their particular communities. And we see that here 38% consider lack of visionary leadership as a problem for the strength of their community life. This one in 41%, this we asked only in the United States in the last cycle in 22 in Ontario and the US, 41%, 4 out of 10 said that the divisions, the disunity in the community is a threat to the long-term strength of the community. There are obviously other practical reasons, lack of events that interest young people, generally lack of interesting, engaging events in the community, and so on. Here, for sake of time, I'm gonna be very good. One of the practical reasons that people, it's not that they're not interested, but time and distance is a hindrance to their engagement with the community. It's not that they are apathetic, it's not that they're not interested in things Armenian, but they don't have enough time in modern times, or they live too far to drive on a midweek to come to a lecture. You know, they have to drive an hour and a half. There is traffic and so on and so forth. Now, language, which is very important, whether historically or in terms of anthropologically and linguistically and so on, in so many dimensions. We ask, about how fluent they are in Armenian. We didn't define what fluency is, but 55% considered that they are fluent in Armenian. In some countries, as I've indicated it on the bottom, it's much higher. Obviously, Lebanon, Montreal, and Ontario is very high Armenian-speaking communities. And Belgium, interestingly, why is a high number there? Because the community is predominantly made of Armenians who came from Armenia. The Hayassanti community in Belgium is overwhelmingly the largest portion of the community. We asked, for instance, about their, this is related to the language, their interest in Armenian daily school. And obviously here we see that almost 6 out of 10, they say that probably they would send their kids to Armenian day school if they had a choice in their given country. Of course, here I want to underline that a wish or a desire is not a reality. I mean, you might have a wish, but when the school opens, you might change your mind, or you might have reasons not to send your children to the Armenian school. But at least the conceptual or the idea that the idea of an Armenian school is quite high among the diasporans. Interest in after school programs is much higher, especially in communities where there are very few Armenian institutions. In some cities, you only have a church and nothing else. So in those kind of communities, the demand seems to be much higher for after school or weekend programs. And when we ask, why would they send their Armenian, their kids to an Armenian school? The reasons. Very interestingly, that 75% say so that they learn the Armenian language. That's the top question result. And then two other important aspects. One is the environment, so that the child will interact with other Armenian kids in the school. And as importantly, they consider the quality of the education as an important motive or incentive to send their kids to Armenian school. Now, to conclude, I like using the idea of the Hratch, as you see here. Someone is chiseling, creating a Hratch. You know, Hratch is both spiritual and cultural, a unique aspect of Armenian identity. And I liken it that today in the 21st century, each Armenian creates its own Hratch, as it were, and you decide how the design would be, how detailed do you want, how many details you want to add, and how elaborate you want to be. So it's a process rather than a given. So throughout our lives as Armenians, we might be working on this Hratch, our Armenianness Hratch, that will represent our Armenianness. So I thank you. And final thing, I have written more about these Armenian aspect of Armenian identity. If you have your smartphones, with your camera, the QR code will take you to that article and you can download it. And on the left, I have put the Armenian Diaspora Survey URL. If you want to look more in detail, there are 4 volumes that we've published about all the results of the research. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tchilingirian. I'd next like to invite Dr. Ghaplanyan to talk about the 4 dominant narratives she identified in her book of survival, security, exceptionalism, and the tension between nation and state. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ani, and thank you to the ARPA Institute for bringing us together for this very timely discussion. Let me start with a general overview, and then I will dive into the 4 narratives. I think while many of today's reflections rightly focus on Armenian identity as it evolved across the diaspora and through history, I come to this conversation from a different angle, from the perspective of how national identity was constructed within the Republic of Armenia itself since independence, as I'm Hayastansi, born and raised in Yerevan. I think bringing that perspective is also important because as my research had shown, our identity has been transformed as part of the political narrative that evolved in post-Soviet Armenia as to what it was to be Armenian in an independent Armenia post-1991. My research examined the intersection of politics and identity formation and how successive governments in Armenia used national narratives to define legitimacy and how they would articulate national interest and mobilize society around this idea. In other words, how political power and identity have continuously shaped one another in Armenia's post-Soviet statehood. So speaking about Armenian today inevitably means engaging with how identity itself has been shaped, contested, and redefined, not only by history, but by politics, by institutions, and also by laws. Over the past 3 decades, Armenia's identity has been both the foundation of statehood and the instrument of its politics. And in the absence of strong institutions, strong governance institutions, identity became a political tool, often used to legitimize power or to define national interest and to manage crisis. This has produced a very particular condition, an identity that is state-narrated rather than society-authored, one that oscillates between survival and sovereignty, between memory and modernity. And the cost of that pattern became painfully visible after the 2020 war. The loss of territory and security exposed not only institutional weakness, but also a kind of narrative exhaustion, the moment when old stories no longer explain new realities. Today, Armenia finds itself trying to rewrite its national narrative under immense pressure, And that's inherently risky because when identity is reformulated reactively, it tends to become defensive and narrow. We see the emergence of a state-centric definition of Armenianness, one that is framed within borders, citizenship, and sovereignty. These are important, but on their own, they reduce the scope of belonging to a political geography. Yet the Armenian nation has always exceeded geography. It has been transnational long before that word entered political vocabulary. It's sustained through education, cultural language, and a shared moral imagination. To deny or minimize that dimension is to fragment what is, in fact, an interconnected political and cultural system. And it risks alienating both the diaspora and the citizenry. I bring often the example of the recent polling that showed that more than 60% of Armenians trust no political leader. That isn't only a governance issue, it's an identity issue. It signals the erosion of collective meaning. So the real challenge, therefore, is not how to preserve identity, but how to reframe it in civic and forward-looking terms, to move from instinct to intention, from survival as a reflex to belonging as a principle. That requires re-anchoring identity in institutions that are participatory, transparent, and intellectually open. It requires acknowledging that the diaspora is not a single actor, but a complex evolving ecosystem like Dr. Tchilingirian presented, diverse in geography, class, generation, cultural belonging, familial belonging. And it requires mechanisms that allow for co-authorship of Armenia's future rather than symbolic consultation. In other words, identity cannot remain a monologue of the state. It has to become a conversation of the nation across borders, professions, and generations. I found myself really puzzled this new academic semester, not puzzled, but as an academic reflecting when I attended school in the 90s and when we studied Armenian history, our history books or our student books were called Հայ ժողովրդի պատմություն in the 90s. Then at some point, I think when I was already in 8th, 9th grade, it was called Հայոց պատմություն. So pay attention to the etymology and the meaning of the words, right? First, it was Հայ ժողովրդի պատմություն, the history of the Armenian people. Then Հայոց պատմություն, very inclusive, the history of Armenian. My daughter, and my oldest son, he's 16 now, he is in 11th grade. His history books were Հայոց պատմություն. My middle child, my daughter, is now she's 9 years old and she's going to 5th grade, and her book is now called of the same subject. It's called Im Հայրենիք. So this is an example of how, as I mentioned, that we are closing off, we are defining the geography of Armenianness today. Just in my generation and with my children, as we studied Հայ ժողովրդի պատմություն, Հայոց պատմություն, and now it's Im Հայրենիք. So loss has forced us into that conversation sooner than we wished, but perhaps it has its hidden value. Historically, Armenian revival has always followed rupture, and the challenge is to turn this one into renewal based on reflection rather than reaction. And being Armenian today, I liked how Razmig earlier said, right now it's like, I choose to be Armenian, so I am Armenian, right? It's that fluid now, the definition of Armenian identity. And let me kind of double down on this, that today it's not simply about guarding our heritage. It's about reconceptualizing, and it's an evolving civic project, if you will, one that links survival to purpose and memory to vision, and a small state to a very large world. And I think it's important to reiterate that all of these concepts are not trapped or they're not mutually exclusive. They're very interconnected. So Ani, let me know if you want me to delve deeper into these 4 narratives that I outlined in my research, or if you'd like to do a round of questions.
We can do either. Actually, let's do a round of questions, and then because yours is more recent, and we can talk about that at conclusion. And this wasn't intended to be mini lectures, but it was so fascinating. I feel like I took 4 different courses in very specific topics, but that I understood just from your mini lectures. So now to turn it a little bit back, if we can shift back a little bit and going back to Dr. Panossian, and in this spirit that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. For the viewers here today, I'd like to begin by asking Dr. Panossian to imagine, if you will, delving a little bit deeper into what you brought up, which is how Armenian identity was constructed and reshaped over the centuries by giving specific examples and highlighting sort of the role of language, which I know is near and dear to you in shaping identity.
Right. So as I said in my opening comments, language came into it late into our, vernacular language, not the grammar, not the written language. The modern vernacular that we speak in its 2 branches came in the 19th century. And this became a very important marker of identity, especially in the diaspora. So we consciously built schools. I'm talking about the Middle Eastern diaspora for the time being. In the United States and France and Europe, it was much more of a challenge. It consciously became an effort to make a group of people speaking diverse languages into Armenian speakers, which was fine for about 3 to 4 decades. And now we're facing the same challenge here. Now we're facing the challenge of assimilation globally, linguistic assimilation globally. And we have come to a point that whereas Hratch's the ADS research shows that 75% would want to send their kids to Armenian school to learn the language, and those Armenian kids who are graduating from Armenian schools, which is a minority of the community, are not fluent in the language, are not reading Armenian henceforth. So where have we gone wrong? What is it that we have done wrong? So we have to start fundamentally rethink the way we teach Armenian. And this rethink is starting to take place now. And we as Ghaplanyan are contributing to this, or leading the charge, so to speak. And that is because we taught Armenian, the language, as a mother tongue, which made perfect sense in the Middle Eastern communities. But now in the Western diaspora, it's not a mother tongue. It's a second language. It's a heritage language, but our methodology of how to teach it has not really evolved. And this is it's a pedagogical problem, and the schools slowly are coming to realize that there is a pedagogical problem. There is an approach problem of how you teach Armenian in a diaspora setting. We're going to be talking a lot about of these issues at a big conference in Los Angeles in February, at the end of February, with USC. And the conference is called "It Takes a Diaspora to Raise a Language." It's a play on an African saying that it takes a village to raise a child. So it takes a diaspora to raise a language. So we want to really highlight this thing, that in the diaspora, we can do it. We can prepare a generation of Armenian speakers, and there are pockets of success. How do we broaden this? And again, and I'm giving the example of schools, but schools is not the only place, right? There are many after schools, there are Saturday schools, there are many, many other mechanisms that one can employ. But we just need to understand that we are failing in certain things in our schools, and we should come to terms with that and not just be very defensive and say, school, to browser. Okay, sorry, you're not producing Armenian readers, Armenian speakers after graduation, and you should be. So I think that's where the conversation is now, and it's I really like the way Irina put it. Forward looking. Okay, learn from the past. Let's move forward. Forward looking. So that's where we're at in terms of the language at this point.
And you touched upon a little bit what you're doing with Ghaplanyan, the foundation. Would you like to discuss a little bit more about what you're trying to achieve?
Sure. I don't want to make this into a plug of the foundation.
But I think in terms of preserving language and
yes. So, but when you look at it, when you look at language, how do you, in this day and age, in the 21st century, what does it mean to revitalize a language? We don't use the discourse of saving a language. We have to revitalize the language. What does it mean? So you need pedagogical tools and materials. So, there is a website called Zinduk where all sorts of innovative pedagogical tools are. You have to produce children's literature. We do that. You have to be involved in the IT sector, spell checker programs, large language models in the Western Armenian language. We as Armenian people cannot bring Western Armenian into the technological world, it's doomed. So we have to do a lot of work on that. And artificial intelligence has to work in Western Armenian. And there are lots of behind the screen sort of programming that needs to be done. So we sponsor that kind of work. There is adult language courses. There is a whole slew of activities like this, and we create into the Zarmanazan summer camp a whole quote unquote village in Western Armenia where through immersion kids learn. We don't even use the word learn. They acquire the language, and they acquire it through fun, through games, not through teaching, not through textbooks, just being completely immersed into it through song and play. And as I have said before, if you don't make Armenian fun at school, you have lost a Western Armenian speaker. It needs to be fun, because a kid in the diaspora does not have to learn Armenian. It's a choice, and they have to like to learn Armenian. And so that comes part of the pedagogy, but that also comes from a set of tools and materials that you provide. Those of you who have kids, watch yertik.com. It's like Sesame Street in Western Armenian.
Can you write it in the chat too? Would you write it in the chat?
Yeah, I can. So it's that's how it's done.
I think just as someone who has studied language acquisition in the sort of realm of child development, I can't emphasize how important it is that you are starting young, and the importance of exposing children before the age of 3 to language.
Yeah, it's a challenge. At the young age, you have to start, but continue at the teenage years, and then give them something to read. Our sort of translation, children's literature translation programs has few books in each age category. Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you. And if you could put that in the chat. Next, I'd like to turn it to Dr. Sanjian. Dr. Sanjian, you talked about so much of the trajectory of sort of Armenian identity, which has come to us down, which has come down to us through written sources, and the problems with that as well, with the sort of who's doing the narrative and who's writing the narrative. Is there anything you'd like to expand on there, or should we talk more about the paradigm shift in the 19th century?
Probably there were paradigm shifts earlier than that on other issues, but ultimately we don't know much about Armenian identity prior to Christianization. We don't have literature. The early Christian authors wrote very little about them, and it's only in the mid-19th century that Armenian scholars start thinking about writing books on Armenian paganism, or even devoting a chapter to Armenian paganism in Armenian history textbooks. The earliest Armenian history textbooks don't have that at all. It was not considered to be a topic to be studied. I'm talking about those in the early 19th century, or in when the first textbooks started to be written. The first one was for the Mkhitari seminary, written for their novices, and so that was it. But the 19th century was very, very fundamental, because ultimately it relegated Christianity to a component of the identity. It raised the issue of language, the spoken language. I said the script was already there, tied to the Christianity, and this idea that, at least in the works of, I think it's Khorenatsi, who says that it was the God's hand basically drew the alphabet letters of the alphabet on the wall when Master of Mashtod was too tired after, which basically became a very fundamental way of looking at that. And so that really has basically the major shift that still basically forms Armenianness up until now. Gradually, we have become relatively secular. We're open, especially the diaspora more than in Armenia, to those Armenian Catholics and Armenian evangelicals being considered to be fully Armenian. We still have problems with Jehovah's Witnesses. We still have problems with Armenian Mormons. Uh, uh, I think there's readiness more to accept the Armenian Muslims in principle because they're a traditional religion, but practical it's not there. So that is actually happening in a way. But I think we are not having that much discussion about identity really on a day-to-day basis in the diaspora, except these kind of sociological surveys. But what is happening in Armenia at the intellectual level, it's really a very intense polemic, which could have been carried out in a much under kind of calmer circumstances, but probably it's really so much tied into politics, power grab, keeping wealth accumulated over the years. All these factors are coming together, who finances the media, and all these kind of things are creating a situation where that discussion is being conducted very intensely over there. As I said, among those educated classes that I know, I'm not that person when I go to Armenia to talk to cab drivers, or when I'm shopping in a mini market, I'll ask the people about what they think about politics. So I really don't know how much that is really going down to the level of the majority of the population. Will there be a paradigm shift? I don't think what is now being suggested by the Prime Minister is a paradigm shift as important as it happened in the 19th century. But it all depends on how things will develop over the years, because identity change, especially the political aspect of it, cannot be never dismantled from the political changes which happen not only in Armenia but around Armenia. And Armenians themselves are a very junior actor, in deciding the political map of the region in the future. So all these things will have an effect on that. And so I think that the 19th century still remains for me the more important kind of a shift in the way the Armenians define themselves. And I think they still define themselves, at least the educated classes, more in the 19th century terms. This word, yes, Mashagutayin Christoniaim, I heard quite a lot this in the summer in Armenia, at the time when the prime minister used to attack the head of the church almost every day on his Twitter account, and that was the major issue. And so it really depends on what the word cultural Christian means. So Hratch and myself have discussed a lot about this, that do we really take Christianity seriously as Christianity, or it's just something in a way? And if it's the second way, it basically means that the 19th century has really, really shifted the way what we think about our own identity.
Well, I'm posing this question to Dr. Sanjian. Dr. Tchilingirian, would you like to add or comment on that? Oh, just you're muted.
Yeah, I'm going to try to connect what Razmig said about language and what Ara said about the state, the Armenian state. The language, I think it's important for us to bear in mind that language is a critical or a very significant identity marker for any nation. I mean, can you imagine a French identity without the language, or German, or Bulgarian, or Greek? So let's kind of think about these issues, on a more relaxed way, rather than making Armenian language as this something sacred that it's beyond reach. So, and in our research also, when people when they are saying that Armenian language, besides family and culture, is important, it includes people who do not speak the language, but they obviously realize that language is a marker. So it's an important aspect. So The question is, to tie it to Razmig's point, that if Armenian is not spoken, what happens to Armenian identity? What kind of Armenian identity we would have in 50 years or 100 years? So this is the question. Secondly, while all these projects are very important, that we have to address them, but we have to also realize the sociological and cultural and political changes that are taking place globally. Now, in terms of assimilation is a process that you cannot fight against, as it were, because over generations, again, in our research, I showed you about the fluency, that there is 55% fluency, but this is the average. But when you look at the younger group of Armenians, you see that it declines, the fluency of the Armenian language. If you look at the 16 to 24 years old group, it's much less, and so on. So the reality is that over generations, language fluency and speaking is going to decline. And another point that we have to emphasize, and I think Gulbenkian does a good job on this, that it's the spoken language that needs to remain vital for the future of the language, because the literary language is there. We have a 1500-year, wealthy literature. The language is there from Karapa to Middle to Modern Armenian. But it's the biggest challenge is the vitality of spoken Armenian. And here I want to tie it now, my final point, to the existence of Republic of Armenia. In my view, yes.
Before you tie it, I was just going to ask you a question surrounding language. And I'm so grateful you're doing this work with the sponsorship of the Gulbenkian Foundation, because I myself am a researcher and recognize the importance of this sort of sacred data that you're collecting that we don't have. But my question is, for example, in terms of language, I have learned that there's tons of bias, right, in surveys and responder bias. And so I'm just curious, I would provide, and I'm sure many of the responses have said that most people want their children to learn Armenian, to speak Armenian, just spoken language. But for example, every parent may say that, including myself, but to actually make the commitment, the time and energy to do this is something different, right? So how do you account for that in your work?
I think based on my experience and research and so on, in diasporic life, the most important space for a language, in this case for Armenian, to be vital is the family, is the home. If you don't speak Armenian at home, the school is not going to solve your problem. A lot of parents, they relegate responsibility for good reason, maybe, because again, time and so many circumstances. So they think that by sending to Armenian school, they're going to learn Armenia. But Armenian, as we know, you have to, in all countries, including the Middle East, it's a couple of hours a week at best. It's not all day long. It's not all
apparently
subject.
Get a visa.
Who?
Sorry.
One of the girls there, she has
So she cannot come.
Excuse me.
she can come. She just needs a visa.
Where? How does the visa works? Yes.
E-visa.
Student,
Yeah.
Student
Attend
Israelia, your microphone is on.
Your microphone is on. Thank you. Sorry about that, Dr. Tchilingirian.
Sorry.
So, a few hours a week is quite limited if you want the language to really become fluent in terms of fluencies and so on. So, family, speaking in the family with your grandparents and whatever is very important. So, but down the road, when we have a couple of generations down the road, how do we resolve this? Because knowing the language, like we speak different languages, right? But if you're not using it, if there is no space where you're practicing or engaging with the language, it's going to get rusty, or you're going to lose, or we speak French, but if you're not using French until you go to France for holidays, your language fluency is automatically reducing. So we have to also be realistic about the type of programs that we in the diaspora that we're doing, so that we're not building up these high hopes that if we do X, Y, Z, then the issue is going to be resolved. But we have to put it in context. But the other long term, and this might sound controversial, I've expressed it in other forums. In my view, if Armenia as a state continues for another 50 years, that's it. If Armenia is a viable state down the road, because there is also this question of could Armenia survive with the changes and so on. But in the next 50 years, let's say, I believe that the Republic of Armenia is going to have much more influence on shaping the Armenian identity in the diaspora, because it's a state, it's a country, because the language and the culture is being produced there on a daily basis, while in the diaspora, we do not have the institutional settings. Our institutions in the diaspora are declining in the last couple of decades, and we don't have the institutional support, or the role of the institutions is reduced in keeping the Armenianness, the Armenian identity vital. So where is it going to come? Already we see the influence of Armenia. Many now in the diaspora are using Eastern Armenian in their emails or Facebook commentaries. Why? Because we have the tools to translate. So they write in English, it translates into Eastern Armenian. So the other element to this is the availability of technology, which is making people less worried about, oh, we should leave, preserve the language, because they say, I can translate it even, the speech now, you can speak in one language, it translates into English, into Armenian, sorry. So I think in the long term, in as much as it's problematic, the role of the Republic of Armenia in shaping Armenian identity, but like any other nation state, whether it's Greece, France, or any country, the influence of the state and its production is going to be much higher than we know today.
Thank you, Dr. Tchilingirian. And I want to now give Irina a chance to jump in. And maybe one question that came up, and you can build off of this, is could one be Armenian without knowing the language? We are talking about identity. So what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that, and Razmig would definitely disagree with me on this. I do think that Armenian identity can be grounded in various aspects, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in the Armenian language. I think that Armenian identity will demand at some point from the individual who identifies themselves as an Armenian to learn the language, and I've seen many cases of such. But I wouldn't argue that if you identify yourself as an Armenian and you don't know the language, that excludes you from being part of the Armenian body politic. I think at some point down the road, it comes as a natural need to learn the language, but I don't know whether Hratch has done part of the inquiry and surveys, what is the actual percentage of Armenians in the diaspora who speak Armenian, right? But nevertheless, if they don't, whether they identify themselves. And I think the presented survey is exceptionally interesting because being part of the family seems to be the driving force of identification of diasporic Armenians as Armenian. And, let me again bring you an example from my kids. They're half Armenian, half American. My husband is American. I'm Armenian, obviously, Haystansi, Yerevan, born and raised. And children are going to Armenian school. They speak English at home. Which is interesting. I speak Armenian with them, they speak English. It seems, and going back to what Hratch was saying, that right now social media, the digital world is driving largely our communication, and even for children who are growing up in Armenian, English seems to be a powerful driving force. So this is where I come both from my academic and personal experience. I don't think vernacular elements are critical to identify as an Armenian. They're certainly important as you solidify who you are as you move forward. Ani, and I want to reflect back on your original question about the four narratives that I had identified as part of my research, looking into political narrative around Armenian national identity. And what I had identified, and I kind of grouped them together, is from the start of the independence, politicians largely articulated narrative that revolved around survival, the concepts of survival, of security, of exceptionalism, and of nation versus state. And these are not only descriptive categories, they are the architecture of modern Armenian political consciousness. So since independence, each administration has selected, amplified, or manipulated these narratives to secure legitimacy. And in doing so, political leadership and the administration effectively governed through identity, transforming collective emotion into political currency. So in the early independence period under Levon Ter-Petrosyan's administration, he sought to move beyond survivalism. What his administration delivered through political discourse was framing peace and pragmatism as expressions of sovereignty, arguing that, and he often quoted this, everlasting interests matter more than everlasting enemies. Yet this rationale, state-building approach collided with the emotional residue of war victory and the moral absolutism of a new opposition led by Kocharyan. And the charge of defeatism weaponized the survival narrative against Ter-Petrosyan and forced his resignation. Then under Robert Kocharyan, the survival frame was fused with security and exceptionalism. Armenia was portrayed as lone fortress in a hostile region surrounded by threat and dependent on Russia for survival. And security was externalized, sovereignty subcontracted. At the same time, the church was elevated to moral authority, linking Christian endurance to state legitimacy. But the synthesis proved deeply contradictory, and oligarchic capture expanded the church itself, became politicized, and exceptionalism was hollowed out by dependence. And then with Sargsyan's administration, these tendencies hardened. And rhetorically, Armenia embraced modernization and European integration, but in practice, it deepened the structural dependency, and the sudden reversal from EU association agreement to the Eurasian Economic Union overnight symbolized that dependency vividly, and identity was once again defined by alignment and not by authorship. And the Sargsyan's project of defining Armenianness remained politically driven, and state narratives invoked culture and nationhood, but rarely as participatory civic projects. So across three administrations, we could see the same pattern. Identity was politicized, used to consolidate rather than to connect, and there was never a sustained civic or academic exercise free from political pressure to define what it means to be Armenian in 21st century. Then came 2018. For a moment, there was a genuine rupture, the possibility of reframing Armenian identity around civic agency, integrity, and accountability. And the Velvet Revolution could have been the beginning of a shift from identity as inheritance to identity as participation. But after the 2020 war, that moment was lost. And the catastrophic defeat forced the government to redefine legitimacy through narrative control. Today, we're witnessing a new identity paradigm, very state-centric, very inward-looking. I mean, there's so much symbolism, right? I don't need to tell our audience about borders and all. And it is a narrative of retreat and not of renewal. Instead of engaging in broad societal reflection, identity is being rearticulated under duress to manage loss, to maintain political survival, to reframe defeat as transformation. And that is risky because it compresses identity to what is governable: citizenship, borders, institutions, but at the same time, it marginalizes what is ungovernable: memory, dispersion, plurality, the global Armenian body politic, and the big mountain aura that I see every day when I drive to work. So the risk is not only alienating the diaspora, it is alienating the citizenry itself. And recent polling shows that, as I said, the recent polling shows that more than 60% of Armenians trust no political figure. And as I mentioned, this is not merely political apathy, it's identity fatigue. It's a disconnection between citizens and the story that claims to represent them. So in conclusion, let me briefly say, where do we go from here? I would say that Armenia's next intellectual project must be to move from instinct to intention, from survival as a reflex to belonging as a principle. And I love Hratch's presentation because there's so much about belonging. But this requires re-anchoring identity in civic authorship, something that we're doing today. And thank you for ARPA for organizing this platform. Identity cannot remain the monologue of the state. In case for us Armenians living in Armenia, for highest aunties, it must become the dialogue of the nation. That means participatory institutions that include diaspora voices, not as donors, but as co-creators, academia and culture reclaiming space for political discourse, and the state recognizing that resilience depends as much on meaning as on military capacity. And I think the state recognizes that very well, and this is why we see that very strong state-driven narrative, symbolism, and articulation of what it is now in post-war Armenia, post-Artsakh lost Armenia, to be Armenian. And as I said, I think as intellectuals and civic activists, we need to reclaim that space of constructing and articulating what it is to be Armenian in 21st century. Thank you.
What about pulling it out? You've described the relationship between Armenia and its diaspora as a failed marriage. What are two concrete steps that we could take to repair this partnership? Or transform it?
Two concrete steps. Okay. I would say, well, first of all, I use the term failed marriage quite deliberately because it captures both proximity and estrangement, love and disappointment. The Armenia-diaspora relationship has always been emotionally charged, but rarely institutionally structured, if you think about it, on both sides. Right. And even now with the most recent administration, when we look back into the previous administrations, there was Ministry of Diaspora, but it was led by a former communist who didn't connect well with the diaspora. And I collected multiple stories about this, and it was fascinating. I also interviewed ministers of diaspora. And then this new administration comes in, closes the Ministry of Diaspora, establishes the High Commissioner's Office, again alienating the diaspora. So this is an example that we lack architecture, and the core of this dysfunction or the failed marriage is this lack of architecture. We don't have agreed framework of representation or accountability. The Armenian diaspora relationship has relied on sentiment and symbolism rather than shared governance. And you know, when you talk to Armenian statesmen about the need to engage the Armenian diaspora in governance, there's constantly this driving powerful narrative, but they're not citizenry, they're not part of Armenian daily life. And this negative narrative continues instead of saying, okay, what do we do to bring diaspora closer to the daily life of Armenia and to increase participation? And similarly, what do we do to bring Hayastansi Armenians from various walks of life? It doesn't necessarily have to be state institutions to participate in our institutions. So I would say, if the two fixes, I would suggest that we focus on creating an Armenia Diaspora Council with real agenda setting power, so that it has legal mandate to undertake activities that are related to both parts of the same body. I would call it that way. And we need to think about how we're codifying diaspora's participation, because as our speakers today were recalling, diaspora is not institutionalized anymore as such. It's not a single body. It's so diverse. So we need to think proactively and innovatively how we engage diaspora more institutional and more structurally. How do we create the architecture where participation becomes transactional in a positive sense of this word? And in reality, we as a small state cannot survive without our global nation. And equally so, our global nation cannot survive without sovereignty, something to root the memory of being an Armenian into. So I would say it's a two-way street, and perhaps it starts with the types of platforms that ARPA created today, where we as civic activists, intellectuals, we reclaim the space where narrative is discussed, and where where the narrative of identity is not captured in a geography. We can't. We're a global nation, and we need to think beyond our borders. Thank you.
Thank you. We have so many questions. It's been such an interesting conversation. I have so many questions, but I'm going to turn it to the audience because they've been patiently waiting. So a couple questions from the panel. Given the historical disappearance of Armenian diaspora communities in places such as India, Poland, and Bangladesh, how long can today's Armenian diaspora communities endure under current conditions, and what factors will determine their survival? We talked about infrastructure. Irina talked a little bit about this. Anybody else want to contribute to that conversation or question? Razmig?
Yes, this always comes up. Look at history, they have assimilated. True. But some communities have continued. I sort of use the metaphor of a mushroom for a diaspora. It disappears someplace, you step on it, it pops up somewhere else. So what are the question for me is not to say they assimilate and therefore we lost. The question for me is to say, in the 21st century, what are the mechanisms that we can employ in order for a group of people 500 years down the road to say, we are Armenian? So, and there are those mechanisms, and we can do that. We can survive as a diasporan community. So, and we have. I mean, you can look at Poland and say we assimilated because the community became Catholic when religion identified you, you assimilate into the Catholicism, and then you disappear. But that's not the case anymore. There is also the possibility, the other way of looking at it is, yes, communities have disappeared, but as a diaspora, as a whole, as a collective, we have continued for 1,000 years in different centers. If Anya, I have to leave for 2 minutes, but and then I come back. I just need to be absent.
Specifically for you, though, I'm wondering, can I ask you before you leave? So great presentation by Dr. Razmig. However, Armenians are by ethnogenetic DNA purist Indo-Europeans in the region. DNA does not change unless you assimilate. DNA defines Armenians, not language and religion, which can change. Please comment on the role of DNA in being Armenian. You are defined as Armenian by your DNA, not by language or religion, is the question.
Well, this is an example of what Ara was saying. In Armenia, there are certain people who believe in not in the constructivist or approach. It's sorry to say, it's a very racialist approach to identity. If so, we all Armenians do DNA test. If somebody is 75% Armenian, someone is 50%, someone is 25%, you just exclude them because their DNA is not 100% Armenian. It's not sorry, but it's not a serious argument, and no one accepts this kind of arguments. But it has become a belief system, and Arak, if he wants, he can talk about that. I profoundly disagree. DNA has nothing to do with identity. DNA has to do with medical conditions. So, medically, it's very useful. But besides that, it has nothing to do with who we are. It has never.
You can take a break. Our husband waiting, Dr. Tchilingirian. I just want to make sure for him. Dr. Sanjian?
To say that some communities have disappeared because people have moved to other locations. We forget about that. Yeah. So it's not that necessarily communities disappear because of assimilation. The roots are less. But today people are leaving Armenia in large numbers. So it's not only the kind of whether it's your land or not. A lot of people find lots of reasons to leave Armenia, yeah? And lots of people are ready to leave Armenia at the moment if given the opportunity. So we have to look at it in a different way to this issue. Secondly, if somebody's DNA could decide the identity, if we find a dead body, we should be able to have a test and declare that person whether he was from Ecuador or from Thailand or whatever, etc. So that's the counter argument to say it's basically not serious.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tchilingirian.
Yeah, I'm asked about this DNA. And my answer is that when you put the DNA under the microscope, it does not show you ethnicity. It does not show you cultural identity under the microscope. It's a physiological phenomenon, DNA. What today, when they use DNA tests, what they tell you is that your DNA is comparable to this geographic location, let's say in Italy or in Turkey or Anatolia, whatever. So it's an approximation. They show where that DNA is mostly concentrated geographically. But it does not, again, it's scientifically, it does not include data on ethnicity and identity and so on.
I think you may have, I don't know if someone accidentally, is this?
It's not, yeah, I see a whiteboard, but I don't know how.
Mr.
Kochunian.
Kochunian, do you mind? I'm sorry. We only have a few 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure to use this up. Thank you, Dr. Tchilingirian. Another question that came up was about what will happen to the Armenian identity when there is no state at all? Can we today extrapolate from the period of, say, 400 years of statelessness when we were occupied by imperialist regimes?
Can I say something?
Yes.
Can I say something about that? What the point that I was making was that we have built an identity and we have maintained that identity without the state, and we can continue to do that. And in 2014, I wrote a little piece saying that we should not be drunk with statehood. So, and this relates to some of the other issues regarding what Irina was saying and the identity issues in Armenia. It's very interesting that identity discussions and the crisis and the existential crisis of identity of Armenians was predominantly a diasporan issue. Now it has also become an issue in Armenia, and Irina's work is fantastic in showing that. Now, we will not know. I think Hratch at one point said something or someone said something, how will Armenians look, what kind of Armenian could be without the language 100 years later? I don't know how Armenians are going to look 100 years later. What I care about is that there are a group of people 100, 200, 300 years later that say we are Armenian. And if they want to learn Armenian, if they want to use the language, that is available to them. So let's not be naive. Millions of people are not going to learn Western Armenian or Eastern Armenian in the diaspora. Our project, what is our project? I mean, our national project should be that we have a core that remains from generation to generation that speaks Armenian, that writes in Armenian. And we do have examples of people learning Armenian, mastering Armenian in the diaspora without schools, even without schools. And we do have a current environment in which younger generation is saying, I want to get back to my roots. I want to get back to my language. I want to learn this language. So it's not a question of, oh my God, we have lost it. No, we have not. I work with people on a daily basis who are adhering to the language, who are adhering to their identity, and they're saying, no, I don't want to assimilate. And this, Hratch, is part of the current global setting, because people in this phase of sameness and assimilation, there is also a cultural revival in specific communities who are saying, no, I don't want to assimilate. I want to be 100% American or French or whatever, but I want to learn my language. And so we're trying to cater to that kind of continuity. I have never, ever said that you need to know Armenian, the language, in order to be Armenian. I have never said that. As much as work we did on Western Armenian, I have never argued that language or identity are the same. They haven't been. Historically, they haven't been. But, my God, we do have a beautiful language, and it's worth preserving it. So what can we do in order to preserve it? Yes, it takes commitment. Parental, school, it takes commitment. It's work. Your kid doesn't learn French out of thin air. You send them to school, you make them do their homework in French. So we have to be honest with ourselves. We have to be modest, but we have to be stubborn as well. We have to say, we're going to stick to this and do the institutional setup to do it. And we're seeing success. Sorry to say, we're seeing success. So,
and Yartik.com is something that you're doing to help ensure this happens through Gulbenkian. Also, that answers Sylvie Terzakian's question about what defines Jewish identity, not language, yet their Jewishness is very strong. Dr. Sanjian, your hand is up.
A couple of just, will the diaspora survive without a state? Definitely, but it will be a very different diaspora, and I dare say, it will be a much weaker diaspora, much less focused diaspora. So that's also a very important kind of situation, because it's having a state with a large, not having a state with a large concentration in what you consider to be your cradle, or your homeland is one thing. Being dispersed, with the same level of, thin spread all around the world, and not having a state, it's another thing. People are discussing now whether the Soviet period should be called the Second Republic or not. But basically, it was a very important structure with some of its limitations, whose presence was very, very important for not only Armenia, but to the outside world. The issue of the Jews. I had once, many years ago, a student who was Jewish. He said he was totally secular. He didn't care at all about Judaism, but he considered to be himself a secular Jew. And I asked him a question. Can secular Jews like you survive if we close down all the synagogues in the world? Yeah, that's the same argumentation whether you can be an Armenian without speaking Armenian. Yes, you can, as long as there is a core out there. Can you be Armenian without the Armenian churches? Yes, you can, as long as there is a core out there. If there is not a core out there, what will be the thing which will connect you? Some kind of a memory that's much more fluid without any kind of structure. So we have to be very careful when we talk about these individual rights, etc. Let us not avoid looking into that there should be something like a core to which you are attached, even with your own freedom of being and choosing those aspects of your identity. That's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Two more really quick questions before we close. I want to honor the audience. Greg asks, do you think a significant Armenian diaspora can reappear in Turkey by reconverting folks who currently identify as non-Armenian but may discover their roots? What would it take?
Will it be a diaspora if it's in historic Armenia? That's another question.
Good response, Razmig. Okay. Another question is, we sort of touched upon this, but again, how long can today's Armenian diaspora communities endure under current conditions, and what factors will determine their survival? Irina addressed this. We talked about infrastructure in Armenia. Anything else anybody wants to add?
Could I quickly, as last comment, I think those of us who are involved with the Armenian world and with these issues on a daily basis almost, I think the practical approach is that we have to think about 3 generations, not about to do something in 100 years, what will happen in 100 years or what happened in 100 years ago. Our parents' generation, ourselves, and the next generation. I think if we focus our efforts on these 3 generations, then it's up to the next generations to take care of themselves. But if we worry too much from now until, year 2500, then it's distracting us.
Yeah.
We need practical.
Yes.
What are our issues now in the diaspora? What are our resources? What kind of programs and activities we can implement, and worry about the next generation. And if we do that, then it will. This has been, as it's been mentioned, for 1,000 years, we've had diaspora, and it has continued, and it will continue, whether we worry or not. But what our generation is called to do is take care of these 3 generations that is part of our ecosystem today.
We have already run out of time. I think we've
I
already
know.
covered 2 hours. I think we should stop.
Yes.
Thank you very much, all panels. But I guess the only person that probably did not make any comments at this time is Irina. Do you have any comments? Maybe if you have any comments, you can do it, and then we'll stop. Sorry.
Just very briefly, I liked Tamar's question about the removal. Very curious about the removal of Mount Ararat as a symbol on Armenian visa stamp, and possibility of removing Mount Ararat image from the country's coat of arms. This is to mollify Turkey. Is our national identity endangered or strengthened by having Turkey cross the border? I think it's a very good discussion. It's a very good question. It caused a lot of havoc in Armenia. It's important to note that there are 2 dimensions to this. On the stamp, the Mount Ararat was added, I think, in 2005. Anyway, in 2000, so it wasn't from the very beginning. And it's usually not very common in practice to have it. So it was, I believe, under Kochan's administration when Mount Ararat was added. On the flip side of, so removing it, current administration argued that it's not a big deal anyway. It wasn't from the very beginning of independence. But on the flip side of thing, I think it's important that this campaign, if you will, against Ararat comes with this deeper political undertone, because there's this underlying misconceived notion that the symbol of Ararat removing it is a diplomatic message, whereas it is not. Ararat symbol for Armenians, as earlier we were discussing, it carries an important civilizational context, right? Because it's the biblical mountain. It defines our Christianity more than it defines our political or any other type of identity, certainly not a state identity of its borders. So in a way, I think it was misconceived and misplaced, this onslaught or campaign against Ararat. And this is why, again, I'm arguing that we need to bring more intellectual rigor and reclaim the space where we talk about these important aspects, so that our civilizational symbols, our core elements of identity, are not politicized to gain zero diplomatic dividends, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, panelists, for this excellent and very interesting discussion. Thank you, Ani, for a perfect moderation. And thank you all for staying with us all these 2 hours. It's been long, I know. And please donate if you like what you hear and what ARPA is doing in Armenia. There's a lot to do in Armenia, and we need your support. Please donate. And also, if we don't have your emails, please send me a note at info@arpainstitute.org. Thank you again, and hope to see you in a week. Next week, we have another panel. This time it's related to the psychological aspects of Aliyev, Ilham Aliyev. A group of psychologists have analyzed his behavior, his past history, his speeches, and so on, and they have made conclusions as to how he thinks and what are the mechanisms that he uses. Thank you. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.